She took the whip to shield a native child, and 5 Apache brothers kneeled in her dust. Dust swirled in tight, angry circles around the trading post as a ranch hand shouted at the small Apache boy who had stumbled into the wrong yard, knocking over a bucket of feed in his panic. And before the child could explain, before he could even breathe, the man raised his whip in a sharp arc meant to teach a lesson no child should ever learn on foreign soil. The boy froze, hands lifted, trembling so hard his knees buckled, and the crowd's mutters thickened like a tightening noose around him. But no one stepped forward to stop what was coming. She did. Without thinking, without weighing danger or consequence, she shoved through the men gathered near the corral, her boots kicking up dust as she sprinted, and just as the ranch hand swung the whip down, she threw her body over the child, shielding him as the leather cracked across her shoulders with a sound that made every head snap toward them. The blow knocked the breath from her chest, but she didn't flinch away. Instead, she tightened her arms around the boy, curling her body to keep him hidden beneath her, her breath shaking as the crowd erupted in startled shouts. The ranch hand stumbled back, shocked, muttering something about interfering with discipline, but his voice faltered as 5 shadows fell across the yard, long, silent, unmistakably Apache. The brothers had been near the trading post, returning from a supply barter, and when they saw the woman shielding the child, her back marked, her body shaking, her hands gripping him as if he were her own, something shifted in the air, a silence heavier than anger, deeper than fear, settling over the gathering like a warning the wind itself obeyed. The eldest brother stepped forward, tall and steady, his expression unreadable, but his eyes locked onto the ranch hand with a calmness far more dangerous than shouting, and the man's knuckles whitened around the whip handle as he backed away a step. Then, too, the bravado draining from him like water through dust. The woman slowly lifted her chin to face the brothers, breath uneven, expecting confusion or suspicion. But instead she found only steady, grounded recognition, as if they understood exactly what it meant for someone with no relation, no reason, and no protection of her own to take a blow meant for a child who carried no safety in this town. The boy clung to her waist, still shaking, and the eldest brother's gaze softened ever so slightly, a flicker of respect crossing his features before he lowered himself onto one knee in the dirt, followed by the other 4 brothers who mirrored him in a silent, powerful gesture that made the entire yard fall still. In that kneeling, the dust seemed to settle, not in surrender but in honor, acknowledging a woman who had done what none of the onlookers had dared. The trading post yard, moments earlier so loud with gossip and casual cruelty, fell into a stunned hush as the 5 Apache brothers remained kneeling in the dust, their broad shoulders still, their eyes fixed not on the ranch hand who had raised the whip, but on the woman who had taken the blow before it reached the trembling child. Men who had once leaned lazily against fence rails now straightened with discomfort, as if suddenly aware that their silence had been witnessed by people who did not measure worth the way the town did. The ranch hand stumbled backward, dropping the whip entirely, his bravado shriveling under the steady, unblinking calm of the eldest brother, whose posture, low but unbroken, carried a message far more dangerous than anger. We saw what she did. We saw what you did not do. The woman rose halfway, keeping one arm wrapped around the child as he pressed his face into her side. And when she looked around, she met a sea of avoidant glances, neighbors pretending to be interested in the sky, boots, or imagined chores as shame prickled across their expressions. Only a few dared to face her directly, and even they seemed unsure whether to apologize or retreat. She winced as her shoulder throbbed, but she kept her back straight, refusing to reveal pain to the same crowd that had allowed it to happen, and the eldest Apache brother took note of her composure with a slight nod as he slowly rose from the ground. His brothers rose with him, forming a silent semicircle around her. Not trapping, not crowding, simply making space where no one else had. The ranch hand muttered, "That kid ruined half my feet. Someone had to teach him." But his voice shook, and a few townsmen shifted uneasily as the eldest brother stepped closer, not touching the man, just standing near enough that the ranch hand felt the weight of his own cowardice press down on him. The brother didn't speak. He didn't need to. His silence said everything. A young woman near the trading post door whispered to her friend. She protected him. Nobody else even moved, and her voice, though quiet, carried through the yard like a verdict. The woman shielding the child tightened her arms around him as he trembled less now, his small hands gripping her sleeve for safety he'd never been offered here. The eldest brother finally turned to her, his voice low and steady. "You did what many would not." And though her breath caught, she held his gaze without flinching, answering softly, "Someone had to." The crowd had no defense against that truth. The woman guided the trembling child a few steps away from the crowd, her hand steady on his back even though her own shoulder pulsed with a deep, throbbing pain that made her breath hitch each time she moved, but she refused to let him see that. He'd already seen enough fear for one day. She crouched in the dust beside him, brushing soot from his cheek with the gentleness of someone who understood what it meant to grow up with more danger than comfort. And the boy lifted his gaze to her slowly, as if unsure whether he was truly safe or merely living inside a brief pause between one cruelty and the next. She didn't speak to him, not yet, because she sensed he needed silence more than explanation, and so she simply stayed there, letting him lean against her arm while she breathed slow and even, giving him something steady to anchor himself to while his world stopped spinning. The Apache brothers watched from a short distance, forming a protective arc without stepping too close, their faces unreadable, but their eyes following every movement of the child with a mixture of concern and restrained anger that burned quieter than any fire the ranch hand could have imagined. The eldest brother took a half-step forward, then stopped, measuring, assessing, understanding that this moment belonged first to the woman who had shielded the boy, and that anything he said too soon might fracture the fragile calm settling over them. The crowd lingered awkwardly at the edges of the yard, shifting their weight from boot to boot, whispering among themselves as if trying to rewrite their own roles in what had just happened. But none dared approach. Even those who cared suddenly realized they had cared too late. The child curled closer against the woman's side, his small fingers gripping her sleeve, and she lowered her head until her forehead touched his lightly. A silent gesture of reassurance that made his rigid shoulders finally soften. The eldest brother's expression changed almost imperceptibly, something tight in him easing as he witnessed the brief, quiet exchange. He glanced at his siblings, and without a nod or a word, all 5 brothers stepped forward in unison. Not quickly, not with threat, but with the slow, deliberate certainty of men honoring an unspoken truth. They came close enough for their shadows to join hers in the dust, but still left space, as if asking permission simply through their presence. The woman looked up, meeting their eyes one by one, and the moment held a weight none of them had prepared for. She had protected one of theirs, and now they would not let her stand alone. The child, feeling their closeness, finally whispered his first words since the whip had fallen, soft, halting Apache. And though she didn't understand the language, the gratitude in his voice was unmistakable. And for the first time since the whip cracked, the yard felt less like a battleground and more like the beginning of an unwritten pact. As the child's trembling eased, the woman rose slowly, every motion tugging at the bruise swelling beneath her shoulder. But she hid the wince behind a calm, steadying breath. The Apache brothers straightened as she stood, recognizing dignity in her posture that had nothing to do with strength of muscle and everything to do with strength of heart. The growing crowd tried to act as though they hadn't been silently complicit, some looking down, others pretending to be checking saddles or crates. But the guilt hanging around them was too thick to disperse. At last, the sheriff pushed through the onlookers, breathless and irritated, his badge crooked and his hat askew, as if he'd rushed from his office after hearing shouts he'd hoped weren't his responsibility. His gaze darted between the dropped whip, the bruised woman, the Apache brothers standing like stone pillars around her, and the child clinging to her skirt. "What happened here?" he demanded, though his tone carried more annoyance than concern, and before anyone else could speak, the ranch hand blurted, "Sheriff, this boy trespassed and ruined my feed. I was correcting him." The eldest brother's expression didn't change, but the shift in the air around him was unmistakable, calm thinning into something sharper. The sheriff swallowed and took a cautious half-step back. The woman stepped forward instead, her voice clear despite the pain radiating through her back. "He's a child," she said, "and you were about to strike him." The ranch hand sputtered. "It was my right." "No," she cut in, her tone steady as a nailed plank. "It wasn't." The crowd murmured, unsure whether to support her or distance themselves, but the Apache brothers' presence made cowardice harder to hide. The sheriff rubbed his jaw, weighing the situation with the reluctance of a man who preferred easy problems and cooperative suspects. "Ma'am," he said finally, "you should let me handle this." She didn't move, didn't yield, didn't defer. Instead, she angled her body slightly toward the child, shielding him with the same instinct she'd shown from the first moment. The sheriff frowned, flustered. "I'm trying to keep the peace." The eldest Apache brother stepped forward, not aggressively, not confrontationally, but with the unwavering authority of someone who had long understood what peace truly meant. "Peace," he said quietly, "begins when someone stops the hand holding the whip." The sheriff looked around for support, but found none. Even the crowd, unsure of their own courage, recognized the truth in the brothers' words. The woman didn't need to add anything. Her stillness said more than speech. There, in the dust between two cultures, two languages, and two different kinds of power, she held her ground not as a savior or a martyr, but as a woman who had simply refused to let a child face harm alone. And for the first time, the town realized she wasn't standing in anyone's shadow. She was casting her own. The sheriff's uncertainty hung in the air like a dust cloud waiting for a wind strong enough to clear it, but the woman had no interest in whatever half-measure he was debating. She was already lowering herself back to the ground, guiding the boy to sit beside her so she could properly check him for injuries. The Apache brothers shifted, forming a loose ring around them, protective, quiet, respectful, but she barely noticed the circle of warriors because the child's shallow breaths held all her attention. She kept her touch gentle, steadying his chin with one hand while brushing dirt from his cheek with the other, searching for any sign that the blow meant for him had done more harm than fear alone could show. The boy didn't flinch from her. Instead, he leaned in, small shoulders trembling as adrenaline ebbed and left him hollow and exhausted. She loosened the ties of his shirt just enough to examine his upper back. Careful, discreet, shielding him from the eyes of the gawking crowd. And though she found only a thin red welt rather than the deeper mark she feared, her jaw tightened at the thought of how easily it could have been worse. She dipped a cloth into a nearby horse trough, wrung it out with firm hands, and pressed it gently to the irritated skin, cooling it with the quiet competence of someone who had tended to bruised children before. Children who weren't always her own. The boy let out a shaky breath, and she murmured soft encouragement, her voice low enough that only he could hear. Across from her, the eldest Apache brother watched with a stillness that felt less like tension and more like reverence. He did not interrupt, did not offer advice, did not claim space. He simply observed, absorbing every detail of how she moved, every careful gesture, every unspoken promise that safety did not have to be negotiated or earned. The other brothers exchanged glances, their expressions subtle but unmistakably softened by the sight before them. A woman who had taken a strike meant for one of theirs now tending to him, as if he had always belonged under her protection. The ranch hand muttered something about making a scene, but this time not a single person stepped toward him. Even the sheriff shot him a warning glare, unwilling to ignite anything further. When she finished tending the boy, she helped him stand, brushing dust from his trousers and smoothing his hair with a thumb that trembled only slightly from the lingering pain in her shoulder. And as the boy reached out, small hand gripping hers in silent gratitude, the eldest brother bowed his head in acknowledgement, a gesture so sincere and grounded it made the entire yard feel different. She had not only protected the child, she had begun healing something far larger than one moment of cruelty. When the boy steadied on his feet, still clutching her hand as if afraid the moment might dissolve if he let go, the woman rose beside him, her shoulder stiff but her posture unbroken. The Apache brothers stood facing her now, not in formation, not in challenge, but in a quiet semicircle shaped by respect rather than strategy. The eldest brother took a single step forward, stopping close enough for her to feel the weight of his presence, but far enough that she could retreat if she chose. For a breath, no one moved. The trading post seemed to hold its air, the townsfolk waiting, the dust settling in slow spirals around boots that dared not shuffle or scuff. He said nothing. She said nothing. The child's grip tightened. And then, without warning, without ceremony, without any demand for attention, the eldest Apache brother extended his open hand toward her in the simplest, most profound gesture he could offer. Palm up, empty, unarmed, an acknowledgement in his culture reserved for those who had shown extraordinary courage on behalf of someone who could not repay it. The woman blinked, stunned, not because she felt unworthy, but because she had not expected honor to arrive so quietly, without witness or fanfare. She did not take his hand immediately. Hesitation flickered across her features, not from fear, but from the unfamiliar weight of being treated with dignity instead of suspicion. But the brother did not push, did not close the distance, did not lower his hand. He only waited, steady as the ridge itself. The crowd watched, unsure what they were seeing, unsure whether to interpret it as alliance or gratitude or something beyond their experience. Even the sheriff, usually quick to assert control, seemed rooted in place, his authority shrinking beneath the power of a gesture that required no badge to command attention. Slowly, cautiously, she lifted her own hand and laid her fingers in his palm. Their hands barely touched. Yet the moment changed the yard more deeply than any raised voice ever had. The brother bowed his head once, a quiet, deliberate motion that felt heavy with meaning, then released her hand gently, stepping back so the space between them belonged to choice, not obligation. The boy exhaled shakily, leaning closer to her side. The other four brothers placed their hands over their chests in silent acknowledgement, a gesture mirrored across tribes to honor someone whose courage had crossed a line that culture, race, and fear had long tried to enforce. She didn't bow. She didn't look away. She simply met their eyes with the same steady resolve she had shown when stepping between the whip and the boy, and the unspoken understanding that passed between them felt ancient, grounding, and impossible to ignore. The yard had changed. She had changed it. She didn't know how large the shift was yet. But the brothers did. And they had already chosen how they would answer it. The sheriff cleared his throat again, louder this time, determined to reclaim authority he'd lost the moment the eldest Apache brother lowered his head in honor. And he stepped forward with the forced confidence of a man who hoped no one noticed his trembling hands. "All right now," he barked. "Everyone needs to settle down. We can't have Apache and townsfolk forming. Whatever this is." His attempt at control fell flat, drifting uselessly across the yard as the woman's steady posture and the brother's silent presence stripped his badge of the weight it usually carried. The ranch hand, emboldened by the sheriff's arrival, pointed a shaking finger at her and snapped, "She started all this, shielding him like she owns the place." But she didn't flinch, didn't respond, didn't waste breath on a man who had already proven how easily he mistook cruelty for authority. Instead, she angled her body subtly toward the boy again, one protective hand resting lightly on his shoulder. That simple gesture silenced more of the crowd than the sheriff's shouting ever could. The eldest brother stepped forward, calm but unyielding. "She protected a child," he said quietly, each word shaped with a clarity that turned the yard colder. "If that causes trouble here, then your trouble is not with us. It is with yourselves." Murmurs spread, some defensive, some shamed, but none loud enough to drown out the truth threading through his voice. The sheriff rubbed the back of his neck, glancing uneasily at the gathering, realizing he had no support strong enough to pressure either side. Not when the woman stood so firm and the brothers stood so ready. "Look," he muttered, softening despite himself. "I just need to know what's being asked here." The eldest brother turned his gaze to her, not demanding, only acknowledging that the moment belonged to her choice. She met the sheriff's eyes steadily. "What's being asked," she said, "is that children, any children, aren't struck in this town again. That's all." The sheriff blinked, surprised by the simplicity, and the ranch hand sputtered, "That's ridiculous. We can't just—" But the crowd's shift cut him off. Several townsfolk who had once looked away when the whip was raised now nodded slowly, ashamed of their own earlier silence. The sheriff exhaled, defeated. "Fine," he muttered. "Fine. No one lays a hand on the boy again. Not here." The child gripped her skirt tighter, and she rested a comforting hand on his hair, steady and sure. The eldest brother inclined his head, accepting the agreement not because it came from authority, but because it came from her. And as the tension thinned, not disappearing but loosening enough for breath, the town understood a truth that made every man shift his weight. The conflict wasn't resolved because the sheriff stepped in. It was resolved because she had refused to step back. The uneasy peace lasted only a breath before a rancher from the edge of the crowd shoved forward, red-faced and furious, his voice slicing through the settling calm like a rusted blade. "So that's it?" he barked. "An Apache brat ruins property, and we just bow to whoever shields him?" His words cracked open the tension again, sending a ripple of fear through the child, and a ripple of shame through the bystanders who knew they'd done nothing but watch. The woman straightened, shifting subtly in front of the boy, and the Apache brothers stepped as one, not lunging, not threatening, but advancing with the grounded certainty of men who had run out of patience for ignorance disguised as courage. The eldest brother's eyes hardened, though his voice remained controlled. "Your anger comes from fear," he said, "but fear does not excuse cruelty." The rancher scoffed. "What do you know about cruelty?" That was when the eldest brother took one more step, closing the gap until he stood directly before the man, close enough that the rancher's bravado faltered under the weight of a gaze forged in battles far older than this town. He didn't raise his voice. "I know that a child with no strength should never be struck to prove a man has some." The rancher swallowed, retreating half a step, but pride pushed him forward again. "You don't belong here," he spat. A low murmur swept through the crowd, some in agreement, more in discomfort. Before the brother could answer, the woman stepped forward, her shoulder still aching but her voice steady. "He belongs here the same way I do," she said, "by standing for what's right." The rancher opened his mouth to retort, but the crowd, finally seeing themselves in the reflection of her calm defiance, shifted. A young man near the livery muttered, "She's right." Another nodded. Even the sheriff's posture straightened slightly, pride giving way to reluctant respect. The rancher, feeling the ground move under him, tried one last time to reclaim the moment. "You're siding with them?" he demanded. The woman didn't hesitate. "I'm siding with the child who was about to be hit." That was the breaking point. The crowd looked at her, not with pity or gossip, but with realization. They had been inches away from letting a child suffer, until a woman with no power, no badge, and no reason stepped into the blow herself. The Apache brothers felt the shift, too. Their formation tightened, not in threat, but in acknowledgement. They were no longer protecting the boy alone. They were protecting the woman who had shown them a kind of courage that did not come from strength, but from conviction. And for the first time, the rancher who had raised the whip seemed small, not because the brothers towered over him, but because the truth had. The rancher's anger sputtered into silence as the crowd's shifting weight made it clear he no longer had their approval to lean on, and the woman's calm, unmovable stance carried more authority than the sheriff's badge had all afternoon. The Apache child stepped closer to her, his small hand gripping the fabric of her skirt, and she rested her palm lightly over his knuckles, steadying him, grounding him, reminding him he wasn't alone. Watching this, the eldest Apache brother exhaled, something heavy leaving his chest, and with deliberate purpose he walked forward until he stood directly before her, the dust of the yard curling around his boots. The crowd held its breath. Without speaking, without asking permission, without demanding acknowledgement, he lowered himself onto one knee in front of her, the posture of honoring someone whose courage had crossed the threshold of their people's deepest values. Gasps rippled through the townsfolk. No one here had witnessed Apache warriors kneel to anyone outside their own clan, not a sheriff, not a judge, not a preacher. But he did it for her. His brothers followed, each stepping forward with the same grounded intention, lowering themselves into the dust in a slow, powerful wave that silenced every whisper, every bias, every lingering doubt about who the true strength in the yard belonged to. 5 Apache men knelt at her feet, not in servitude, not in surrender, but in respect. The child's breath caught, his eyes widening in awe, and the woman felt her own heart stutter as she instinctively stepped back, overwhelmed, humbled, entirely unprepared for such reverence. "I didn't do anything worthy of this," she whispered, voice trembling despite her attempt to steady it. The eldest brother lifted his head slightly, meeting her gaze with a calm that held no room for disagreement. "You took a blow meant for him," he said, "and you did it without fear." She opened her mouth, shaking her head, but he continued, "Strength is not measured by limbs or weapons. It is measured by who you protect when you are outnumbered." The crowd listened, struck quiet, not because of the words alone, but because they spoke aloud what they had all avoided seeing. The rancher who had wielded the whip lowered his eyes, shame burning hot across his face. Even the sheriff seemed smaller. The woman swallowed hard, the moment folding into her like a truth she had never known she needed. She had stood for a child she barely knew, and 5 men from a world the town feared had recognized her courage before her own people did. She didn't bow, she didn't step back. She simply met their eyes, steady as the ridge behind them. and in that stillness, something unspoken and irreversible settled. Dust remembers who kneels and why. By the time the last of the tension eased from the yard, the sun had dropped behind the low ridge, leaving only the pale afterglow that made everything softer. Faces, silhouettes, the dust settling over footprints that would vanish by morning but never be forgotten. The woman exhaled slowly, her breath trembling not from fear but from the weight of what had just happened. A child saved, a town confronted, 5 Apache brothers kneeling in a way that rewrote everything she thought she understood about courage and honor. She helped the boy stand a little taller, brushing dirt from his shirt and smoothing the hair above his brow with gentle fingers, and he leaned into her touch without fear this time, his small voice quiet but steady when he whispered something in Apache that made the eldest brother's gaze warm with meaning. She didn't understand the words, but she understood the tone. Gratitude, soft and honest, the kind that didn't need translation. The sheriff, still stiff and awkward, cleared his throat and muttered something about ensuring justice. But the words fell flat, forgotten as quickly as they escaped him. The crowd began to disperse, slow, uneasy, changed. Each person walking away with the memory of a woman who had stepped where they hadn't, and 5 men who had showed honor where others showed hesitation. The ranch hand vanished entirely, shame tightening his shoulders like a vice. When the yard finally emptied, the Apache brothers approached her, not close enough to overwhelm her, but close enough that their presence felt protective rather than imposing. The eldest brother placed a hand lightly over his chest, the gesture of respect repeated now without the weight of an audience. "You gave him something today," he said quietly. "Something we will not forget." She shook her head, her voice soft. "I only did what anyone should have done." "Yes," he answered, "but you were the one who did it." The boy took her hand again, not gripping in fear, but holding with trust, and she felt something shift inside her, a quiet settling, as though her world had widened in a direction she had never expected. The brothers prepared to leave, but the eldest paused, turning back toward her with a final nod that carried the strength of a promise, not a debt. "If ever you are in need," he said, "you will not stand alone." She met his gaze, steady and unafraid. "And neither will he," she replied, nodding towards the child. The faintest hint of a smile touched the warrior's expression before he turned and followed his brothers across the fading twilight. The boy released her hand, only to wave at them as they departed, and all 5 warriors raised a hand in return, silent, unified, unbroken. When the dust finally settled around her feet, she realized the day had ended not with division, but with an unexpected thread of connection tying strangers into something almost like family. And in that quiet, she let herself breathe, not as the woman who jumped into danger, but as the woman who had helped pull a child's world back into the light. Please like, share, and subscribe to support more true-hearted stories on Stories Left Behind. If you saw a mother and her twins sleeping on a bench, would you have stopped like the cowboy did, or walked on? Tell us in the comments.